In this video, I want to talk about 5 common types of bias that we find in feedback and what you can do to minimize them. Number 1 is confirmation bias, and this is our tendency to notice things that confirm what we already believe to be true, our prejudices. It also leads us to discount evidence that seems to conflict with our expectations or our beliefs or our existing understanding of things. Confirmation bias therefore leads us to select the evidence that we pay attention to and favour the evidence that confirms what we already think is right. As a result, confirmation bias is arguably the single most destructive human trait. In the workplace, we can minimize confirmation bias by being ruthlessly rigorous in collecting fresh data each time and analyzing it bottom up. Rather than looking for the data that confirms the story we want to tell, we look at the data cold and find out what story the facts tell us. When we find surprising results, we test them out. When we find a single piece of evidence that conflicts with our expectations, we investigate it further. Second is the horns or halo effect. This is our tendency to extend our experience of a person from one sphere into another sphere and other spheres and other areas of work. If we already think that they are a poor performer, you've got little devil horns, then we might assume that in other areas they also perform poorly and therefore they are a poor worker. It's the confirmation bias at work. If, on the other hand, we think they are a great performer in one area, then what do we expect to see in other areas? Great performance. They have a halo. As a result, we tend to see the halo of excellence or the horns of incompetence as permanent features of an individual, which of course they're not. We minimize the horns and halo effect by evaluating each situation on its own merit. Every time we want to give feedback, we gather fresh evidence and look at it as a freestanding set of data points. The third bias is selection bias, and this arises when we select which evidence to assess, which evidence to focus on, and therefore which evidence to neglect. Indeed, when we observe one situation, we may choose to focus on some aspects of it rather than others. That too is selection bias. As a result, we can minimize this by either observing everything or, if we can't do that, making sure that our selection is randomized. Roll the dice, flip a coin, make a random choice about what you are going to observe, and take a large enough sample size so that you can be sure that you haven't inadvertently randomly selected an unrepresentative sample. The fourth bias is recency or availability bias. This is our tendency to pay more attention to recent events or to use the most easily available evidence, which is often from the most recent events. Of course, the consequence of this is that we discount prior or less easily accessible evidence. One way to minimize this kind of bias is to give feedback often. That way, all feedback is based on recent observations. Another way is to collect data, collect evidence continuously, and then, when it's time to give feedback, to synthesize everything. The final type of bias is agency or attribution bias. This is the bias that leads us to assume cause and effect. If someone is there when something happens, we assume that in some way they caused it. They have agency, the ability to influence events. Of course, we believe things happen for a reason. There is a common saying, I don't believe in coincidences. But the fact is that coincidences do happen. Chance does play a part in events. Outside influences do affect outcomes. It is not always the case that errors are somebody's fault, nor indeed that their successes are always evidence of their excellence. If we make those assumptions, we discount the genuine impact of randomness. And there is plenty of evidence that some star performers in the investment market who appear year after year to outperform the market can themselves be outperformed by goldfish selecting stocks randomly. The fact is that if you have enough professional investors, some of them are bound to have a long run of successes and therefore look like they know what they're doing better than their colleagues do. If your colleague has a run of good or a run of bad luck, and you ascribe it to either their excellence or their incompetence, then either way, you're doing them a disservice. Minimize this by examining carefully how much ability they actually had to influence outcomes. This is agency. If they had made different choices, if they had done different things, would events have turned out differently? And when they made the choices that they did make, what were their thought processes in selecting them? Also, look at the widest possible range of performance factors and do so over the longest possible time period. Runs of luck do come to an end. However, with work, strengths continue to develop and get stronger. Eliminating bias in any walk of life, and in particular in feedback, is difficult. The first step is vital, and that step is to recognize the place it has and the sources of those biases. Once you recognize them, you can start to take steps, if not to eliminate the bias, to minimize it and to work around it. Please do give a like if you've enjoyed this video. I'll be making loads more great management courses content for you, so please do subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of it. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and in the meantime, keep learning.